The music was still playing when my son struck me for the first time. Then again, and again 12 times in total, each slap echoing through the hall like a drum of shame. Guests gasped, some laughed nervously, others froze with wide eyes. My ex-wife turned her face away, pretending not to see, and my new daughter-in-law stood there, trembling, her makeup streaking as tears began to fall. I stood there motionless, my cheeks burning, my soul splitting open. But I didn't shout. I didn't curse. I smiled. Because deep down, I already knew something they didn't. The quiet truth that would silence them all before the night was over. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and soft jazz. It was everything my son, Ethan Ward, had ever wanted. Elegant, expensive, a showcase of power and new beginnings. Charleston's riverside glowed outside the tall glass windows. People in silk dresses and tailored suits held champagne, speaking in polite laughter. I stood at the edge of it all, a man of 58, in a suit that was 2 seasons too old, but pressed with care. I had worked with these hands for decades. Hands that once built homes. Hands that once fed my boy when his mother walked out. Tonight, those same hands trembled slightly around the glass of water I held. My name is Michael Ward, and I used to think there was no greater pride than watching your child become something more than you. When Ethan walked across the room, handsome in his black tuxedo, I felt a strange ache of pride mixed with distance. He was marrying Chloe Evans, daughter of the mayor, and the entire hall buzzed with the kind of admiration reserved for the powerful. People whispered about how the son had made it big, how he'd lifted himself far beyond his working-class roots. I could hear snippets. That's his father. Oh, he looks so ordinary. I smiled politely when introduced. I shook hands with strangers who didn't care to know me, their eyes flicking over my calloused fingers. They saw a man who didn't belong. I didn't mind not at first. This was Ethan's day, his moment. I was only here to witness it quietly, proudly, as a father should. But pride can be fragile when surrounded by arrogance. Linda, my ex-wife, moved through the room like she'd never known me. Her hair perfectly styled, her laughter perfectly practiced. When our eyes met, hers went cold. "Michael," she said curtly, then turned away before I could respond. She had always cared more about appearances than people, and tonight she had the perfect audience. The ceremony passed without a word between Ethan and me. I watched him exchange vows with Chloe beneath a floral arch sunlight, streaming through the windows like a blessing neither of them understood. When they kissed, the crowd cheered. I clapped softly unnoticed, then waited as people crowded around to take photos. No one invited me closer. Still, I stood there smiling, reminding myself that love isn't measured by acknowledgement. Later during the reception, I sat alone at a corner table. My plate was untouched, the laughter of others ringing in my ears. I thought about the nights I'd worked overtime to pay for Ethan's school, the years I'd gone without rest to make sure he never lacked. Every sacrifice felt small now, compared to the distance that had grown between us. I watched him across the room, laughing with friends, his arm around Chloe's waist. For a moment, he looked over at me, just a glance, and I lifted my glass in quiet congratulations. He turned away. The music grew louder, and I realized I was invisible in the room, built on my sacrifices. Then came the moment that changed everything. It began as something small, a drunk joke from one of his friends. "Hey, Ethan," the man slurred, "you should thank your old man for bringing those hands to fix your mistakes." Laughter followed. Ethan chuckled, embarrassed, but instead of defending me, he walked toward my table. The hall grew quieter as he approached. He stopped beside me, the smell of whiskey on his breath. "Dad," he said loudly, smiling for the crowd, "you always wanted to be part of something big, right? Well, here you are." His tone was playful, but his eyes were cold. Why don't you stand up? Let's give everyone a good look at the man who taught me how to work hard. I stood slowly, unsure what he meant. Ethan, I said softly, you don't need to. The first slap came quick. A sharp, stinging sound that cut through the music. My head turned from the force, but I didn't react. Gasps filled the room. Someone laughed nervously. What are you doing? I whispered. He slapped me again, and again, 12 times. Each strike harder, crueler, a rhythm of humiliation. My vision blurred, my ears rang. I could hear someone saying, "Stop, Ethan, please." But he didn't. His friends laughed, egging him on. Linda stood by the bar, her face frozen, unable or unwilling to stop him. Chloe covered her mouth in horror. The 12th slap landed heavier than the rest, and the room fell silent. The band stopped playing. Only the hum of the air conditioning filled the air. I straightened my jacket blood at the corner of my lip. I met Ethan's eyes. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Maybe he expected me to explode, to shout, to fight back. Instead, I smiled. It was a small, broken smile, but it carried something deeper than anger. I could feel hundreds of eyes on me, waiting. "Congratulations, son," I said quietly. "You've made everyone proud tonight." He blinked, confused, and the silence grew heavier. No one moved. No one spoke. I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat. Then I turned, picked up my coat, and began to walk toward the door. My steps echoed across the marble floor. No one stopped me. Outside, the night air was cool and clean. I breathed it in like a man freed from a burning room. Behind me, laughter tried to restart, but it faltered, hollow and forced. I kept walking toward the parking lot where my old truck waited. My hands still trembled, but not from pain. As I reached the truck, I looked back once at the glowing windows of the hall. I could still hear faint music, muffled laughter trying to patch over the shame. Inside that building was everything I had built and everything I had just lost. I touched the side of my face gently. The sting was real, but it wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing the world had watched a father be humiliated by his own blood. I stood there under the quiet sky, the scent of the river drifting through the air, and whispered to myself, "Respect cannot be begged for." Then I opened the door, sat down, and stared at my hands, resting on the steering wheel, hands that had once built a home, shaped a future, raised a son. Now they would build something else, something final. As the headlights cut through the dark road, I drove away in silence. My heart was steady, my mind calm. They thought they had broken me, but they had no idea what I had already done long before the first slap fell. By the time the night ended, their laughter would stop. And when it did, the hall would fall silent for reasons none of them could ever forget. The morning after the wedding was unusually still. Light crept through the curtains, falling across the small living room where Michael sat in silence. The bruises on his cheek had darkened overnight, but he didn't feel pain, only a heavy quiet that pressed against his chest. He stirred his coffee without drinking it, watching the swirl of black liquid move like time itself. The photographs on the wall watched him back Ethan's graduation. Ethan's first baseball game, Ethan at 10 years old, holding a wooden birdhouse they had built together. Each one was a reminder of love that once felt eternal. He whispered to himself, "I raised him better than this." The words floated into the empty room and disappeared. He stood slowly, moving toward the small shelf by the window. Dust lined the edges of old papers and tools. He picked up a framed picture of Linda, his ex-wife, smiling beside a younger version of himself. Her beauty had once been his comfort. Now it was a ghost. He placed it back down gently. The ache in his chest wasn't just from the slap, it was from the weight of years spent building a life that had turned against him. As the morning sun brightened, he let his thoughts slip backward to the years when everything still felt whole. Back then, the sound of hammers and saws had filled his days. He had been a construction worker in Columbia, South Carolina, strong-backed and quiet, earning just enough to keep his small family safe. Linda had once admired his discipline, though her admiration had slowly turned to impatience. "You're too simple, Michael," she would say. "You could be more if you just looked higher." But Michael had always believed in honest work. He wore his pride in his calloused hands and his worn-out boots. When Ethan was born, that pride turned into purpose. He worked 2 jobs for the first few years: construction during the day, warehouse shifts at night. Sleep became a luxury he could no longer afford. Yet each time he saw Ethan's small face sleeping in the crib, he felt rewarded. "This is for you," he would whisper into the darkness before heading out the door again. Every nail he hammered, every roof he repaired, was another promise to his son's future. On weekends, when exhaustion finally caught up to him, he'd sit with Ethan in the yard and show him how to build small things: a box, a stool, a wooden toy. "Always measured twice, cut once," he'd say. Ethan laughed, his little hands clumsy but eager. Those moments were worth every sleepless night. The years rolled forward, and the boy grew stronger. Michael taught him patience, how to tie knots, how to shake a man's hand firmly and look him in the eye. "Your word is your bond, son," he'd tell him. "Don't break it for anyone." Ethan would nod, his eyes full of trust. At the time, Michael thought he was teaching him everything he needed to know. What he didn't realize was that life would soon teach Ethan something else entirely: how to forget where he came from. Linda began changing before Michael saw it coming. She joined social events, started dressing differently, speaking differently. She spoke less about family and more about connections. When money became tight, she grew resentful. "You're always working, but we're never moving forward," she snapped one night. Michael didn't argue. He just stared at the floor, feeling the first crack in his marriage. Ethan, only 13 at the time, heard every word from his room upstairs. Then one night, Linda didn't come home. When Michael finally found the courage to call her, she answered with a tired sigh. "I can't live like this anymore," she said simply. "I've found someone who can give me the life I deserve." The phone line went silent after that. Michael didn't chase her. He looked around at the small house he'd built and at the boy sleeping down the hall. "It's just us now, son," he whispered. Those were hard years, but they were also the most honest. Michael woke before dawn every day, packing Ethan's lunch before heading out. He fixed roofs, poured concrete, repaired fences, anything that paid enough to keep food on the table. There were nights when the only dinner was soup and stale bread. But Michael never complained. He'd make jokes at the table, pretending it was all part of a game. Ethan would laugh, not realizing his father had skipped meals so that he wouldn't go hungry. Ethan excelled in school. He had his mother's quick wit and his father's determination. Michael couldn't have been prouder. When Ethan graduated high school, Michael stood in the back of the crowd, clapping until his hands hurt. He remembered thinking, "This is it. This is why I worked all those years." Afterward, they shared a small meal at a diner, just the two of them. Ethan talked about going to college, about business, about making something big out of his life. Michael nodded, encouraging him. "Build it strong, son. Build it honest," he said. College changed Ethan. He came home during the first few holidays, still warm and respectful. But each time he returned, something about him felt more distant. He started dressing differently, speaking more sharply. He laughed less. He brought up people Michael didn't know, investors, partners, connections. Michael didn't understand the world his son was entering, but he never interfered. "I just want him happy," he told himself, even as the phone calls came less frequently. When Ethan graduated college, Michael sold his truck to help pay off some of his student debt. He didn't tell Ethan about it, not wanting him to feel guilty. He thought love meant quiet sacrifice. But silence, he would later learn, can also be mistaken for insignificance. Years passed and Ethan's visits became rare. Once when Michael called to ask if he could come to Thanksgiving dinner, Ethan apologized, saying he was too busy preparing for a meeting. "Next year, Dad," he promised. Next year never came. The first time Michael felt the sting of true disrespect was during a charity event where Ethan received an award. Michael showed up proudly in his best jacket, standing at the back of the hall. When Ethan was called to the stage, he looked radiant, confident, powerful. Michael clapped louder than anyone, but when the host asked Ethan to introduce his parents, he only mentioned Linda. "My mother taught me ambition," he said with a smile. Michael froze. The applause roared around him, but his ears rang with silence. After the event, he approached his son quietly. "You did well," he said. Ethan nodded absently, checking his phone. "Thanks, Dad. I didn't think you'd make it." Michael smiled faintly. "I always do." That was the last long conversation they shared before the wedding invitation arrived years later. Now sitting in his small kitchen with his coffee gone cold, Michael replayed those moments like old film reels. He saw the laughter, the struggle, the pride, and how it all led to this quiet, painful morning. He stood walking to the window, watching the light break through the clouds. He whispered softly, "I gave him everything a man could give." His voice didn't tremble. It was calm, steady, final. He placed his coffee cup in the sink, washed it carefully, and dried it with a towel. Then he went to his desk and opened a drawer, pulling out his old notebook. The pages were filled with years of scribbles, job lists, expenses, fragments of thoughts. On a fresh page, he wrote one simple line. "Respect is not a gift, it's a responsibility." He looked at the words for a long time, then closed the notebook. Through the window, the morning was unfolding in soft light. Somewhere in another part of the city, his son was waking up in a world built on his father's back. Michael smiled faintly, not with bitterness, but with clarity. Maybe, he murmured, "It's time this house speaks for me." He didn't yet know what those words meant, but the seed had been planted. The clock ticked softly in the background, the sound like a heartbeat returning to rhythm after years of silence. The past, with all its devotion and pain, was behind him now. What lay ahead was something different, something deliberate, something quiet. Michael walked to the door, feeling the weight of the years lift from his shoulders. The bruises on his face were still there. But inside, something had begun to heal. He stepped outside into the sunlight, the air sharp and clean against his skin. The day had begun like any other, but deep down, he knew it marked the start of something new. The man who once built homes for others was finally ready to rebuild himself. Ethan came home for the first time in almost a year. The sound of a sleek car engine rolled up the gravel road, cutting through the afternoon quiet. Michael stepped onto the porch, wiping his hands on a rag, his heart thudding with something between pride and unease. The car that stopped in front of his house gleamed black and perfect, a mirror of success. Ethan stepped out in a tailored suit, phone pressed to his ear, voice clipped and professional. "Yeah, wire the funds by Friday. No delays." He ended the call and smiled at his father, but it was a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Dad," he said, pulling Michael into a quick hug, "you look good." Michael smiled softly. Still standing, still building. Ethan laughed politely and looked around. "You really haven't changed a thing here, have you?" Michael shook his head. "Why would I? It works." The words hung in the air like a reminder of two worlds no longer aligned. Inside, Michael served dinner, simple roast chicken and vegetables. Ethan glanced at the old table, the same one he'd eaten at his whole childhood. "You still use this thing?" Michael chuckled. "Built it myself. Stronger than it looks." Ethan nodded absently, already reaching for his phone. Notifications flashed across the screen. He replied to messages while chewing. "Business never sleeps," he muttered. Michael watched him quietly. His son looked like a man from another planet, confident, polished, unreachable. "So how's the company?" Michael asked. Ethan smiled with practiced ease. "Growing fast. We're negotiating an investment deal with a European firm." "It's complicated stuff, Dad." Michael nodded. "Just make sure it's honest." Ethan laughed softly without looking up. "Dad, the world doesn't work like it used to. It's not about honest. It's about smart." That was the first crack. It was small, barely visible, but it widened something deep inside Michael. He said nothing more. After dinner, Ethan stood to leave, apologizing that he couldn't stay the night. "Meetings in the morning," he said. Michael walked him out to the car. "Drive safe," he said simply. Ethan nodded, distracted already, back on his phone. The taillights disappeared down the road, leaving behind the smell of exhaust and silence. Weeks passed before Michael heard from his son again. Calls came less frequently. When he did call, Ethan sounded rushed, impatient. "Sorry, Dad, I'm in a meeting," he'd say. "Can I call you later?" Later rarely came. Michael never complained. He told himself it was just how life went when children grew up. But the empty house disagreed. The quiet after those calls felt colder than any winter wind. At the grocery store, neighbors would ask, "How's Ethan still running that big company?" Michael smiled. "He's doing well. Busy, you know." They'd nod approvingly. "You must be proud." He was. He always would be. Pride, he learned, could survive even when love began to fade. Months later, a local charity invited Michael to an event honoring successful young entrepreneurs. Ethan was on the list of honorees. Michael's chest swelled with pride. He bought a new tie, the first in years, and took a bus to the city. The ballroom was filled with polished people, chandeliers glinting above them. When Michael arrived, a young woman at the door glanced at his old jacket and asked if he was part of the catering crew. He smiled politely and showed his invitation. "I'm a guest," he said quietly. Ethan stood on stage when Michael entered, his voice strong, his smile wide. "I wouldn't be here without the values my mother taught me: discipline, vision, ambition." The audience clapped. Michael's applause was slow, confused. His name hadn't been mentioned. He told himself it didn't matter. Maybe Ethan forgot. Maybe he'd say something later. After the ceremony, Michael waited at the edge of the room while Ethan was surrounded by reporters and admirers. When their eyes met, Ethan's expression flickered embarrassment, maybe, or discomfort. He walked over quickly. "Dad, you came," he said, his voice low. "Wouldn't miss it," Michael said. Ethan smiled tightly. "You didn't have to dress up. It's just a small event." Michael's smile faded a little. "I wanted to see you." Ethan nodded, looking over his shoulder. "I should go mingle. Investors and stuff." Michael nodded. "Of course." He left before dessert was served. On the way home, the bus rattled through the quiet night. Michael stared out the window, his reflection staring back. The suit he wore suddenly felt too tight, the tie like a rope around his neck. He thought about Linda, about how she had once said he didn't fit in her world. Maybe Ethan thought the same now. The next time Ethan called, his tone had changed completely. It was colder, sharper, as though every word had to fight its way out of his mouth. "Dad, I'm trying to handle some big deals here." "I can't always pick up the phone, okay?" Michael said softly. "I understand. Just checking if you're doing all right." "I'm fine," Ethan said quickly. "Anyway, I'll call you when things settle down." The line clicked dead. Michael stared at the receiver, hearing only the echo of his own heartbeat. Over the next few years, distance turned into silence. Ethan stopped visiting. Linda reappeared in her son's life, now dressed in luxury, often seen beside him at public events. In every magazine photo, they looked like the perfect pair, a successful mother and her brilliant son. Michael's name was never mentioned. He watched it all unfold from afar, clipping articles and tucking them into a drawer he rarely opened. Then one summer evening, Ethan invited Michael to a dinner. The call surprised him. "It's been a while," Michael said, his voice warm. "Yeah," Ethan replied. "There's something I want to show you." Hope flickered in Michael's chest. Maybe it was reconciliation. Maybe his son missed him after all. He wore his best shirt and took the train to the city. The restaurant was elegant, all glass and soft light. Ethan sat at a table with several people in suits. When Michael arrived, Ethan stood briefly to greet him. "Dad, this is my team." Michael smiled politely, shaking hands. "Nice to meet you all." One of the men grinned. "So you're the man who taught him to build things, huh?" Ethan laughed lightly. "Yeah, with a hammer and a dream." The table erupted in laughter. Michael chuckled too, though the joke sat like a stone in his stomach. As the night went on, Ethan spoke of his business triumphs, his strategies, his success. He never once mentioned his roots. He looked like a man who had rewritten his own story and erased the author. When the bill arrived, Michael reached for his wallet out of habit. Ethan stopped him. "Please, Dad, it's fine. Let me handle it." Michael nodded. "All right." But then Ethan added quietly, "It's just that this place is kind of high-end. I wouldn't want you to worry about the price." Michael froze for a moment. He smiled, said nothing, and folded his hands in his lap. The moment passed quickly for everyone else, but for Michael, it echoed endlessly. After dinner, he walked out alone into the cool night. The city lights shimmered like broken glass. For the first time, he admitted to himself that something in his son had changed beyond repair. Respect, once unspoken but understood, had faded into casual dismissal. Back home, he sat at his kitchen table, turning the family watch over in his hand, the one his father had given him. He had meant to pass it down to Ethan, but something stopped him. "He's not ready," he murmured. He placed the watch back into its box and closed it carefully. In the months that followed, Ethan grew busier, colder. When Michael tried to visit his office one afternoon, the receptionist smiled politely and said, "Mr. Ward isn't available without an appointment." He left without arguing. Pride still lived quietly in him, even when love hurt. Then one day, a friend stopped by Michael's house with a newspaper. "You've seen this?" he asked. The headline read, "The Self-Made Man, Ethan Ward's Rise to Power." The article praised Ethan's discipline and brilliance, describing his mother as his greatest influence. Not one mention of the father who built the home he grew up in. Michael folded the paper neatly and placed it in the drawer beside all the others. That night, as he sat by the fire, the glow flickering against his tired face, he whispered, "He's my son, but he's no longer my reflection." He stared into the flames, realizing that love alone wasn't enough to hold respect. Something inside him hardened, not into anger, but into clarity. He saw the truth as plain as the firelight on his hands. The bond between them had cracked long ago, and he had been too proud or too hopeful to admit it. He leaned back in his chair, the sound of the clock ticking behind him. The same clock that had watched them both grow. Its steady rhythm reminded him of something he once said to Ethan as a boy, "Measure twice, cut once." He smiled, faintly eyes on the dying fire. "Respect," he whispered, "needs to be measured the same way." The flames dimmed, leaving the room bathed in soft orange light. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying with it the quiet truth that the father's silence had been mistaken for weakness, and that silence would soon have to speak. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under Michael's door with the rest of the mail. He didn't recognize the handwriting at first. The paper was thick, the kind of expensive stock used for formal events. He turned it over, saw the gold edge, and his breath caught. His name was written neatly across the front, Mr. Michael Ward Guest. The word guest settled in his stomach like a stone. For a long moment he just stared at it, the letters blurring slightly in the morning light. When he finally opened the envelope, a wave of perfume and wealth spilled out. Inside was the invitation to his son's wedding, embossed in gold ink, signed not by Ethan, but by Mr. and Mrs. Ethan Ward. He smiled faintly, though his eyes darkened. "A guest," he murmured. "At my own son's wedding." He set the invitation down on the table next to his half-empty coffee cup and looked out the window at the yard he had built with his own hands. The wind moved gently through the trees, and for a moment he felt nothing but the hum of the clock behind him. He could have stayed home. He could have pretended he never received it. But something deep within him refused to be erased so easily. "I'll go," he said softly. "Not for him, for myself." He spent the week preparing quietly. The suit he chose was old, but neatly pressed the same one he had worn to Ethan's graduation. He cleaned his shoes with a rag, buffing them until they reflected the morning light. He shaved carefully, combed his graying hair, and folded the invitation into his jacket pocket. As he moved around the small house, he caught glimpses of his reflection in the window, a man older worn, but steady. At the grocery store, a neighbor spotted him and smiled. "Big event coming up, Mr. Ward." "Mr. Ward?" He nodded politely. "My son's getting married. That's wonderful. You must be proud." He hesitated, then smiled. "I always have been." That night he took out the small wooden box from his dresser. Inside was the wristwatch he had repaired months ago, the one he'd meant to give Ethan as a gift, a simple heirloom passed down from his father. The leather band was worn, but the watch ticked perfectly. He traced the rim with his thumb, whispering, "A man's time is measured by how he treats those who built him." He polished it one last time, then placed it in a small velvet pouch. The day of the wedding arrived bright and sharp. Charleston's riverfront shimmered under the sunlight. The venue was a grand hotel lined with glass and marble, filled with guests who spoke in voices dipped in money. Michael arrived early. The invitation in hand, his gray suit pressed his shoes shining. The valet hesitated when he stepped out of his old truck. "Sir," the young man said carefully, "this entrance is for guests." Michael smiled. "I am a guest?" The valet blinked, then nodded, taking his keys hesitantly. Inside, chandeliers glittered like frozen fire. The air smelled of lilies and champagne. Michael's eyes adjusted slowly to the glow. People in elegant suits and dresses moved gracefully from one group to another, laughing softly, clinking glasses. He felt invisible, like a ghost in a house he had built but no longer owned. He made his way toward the back where a small sign read, "Guests." He took a seat in the corner near a window overlooking the water. The music was soft, classical, and distant. The ceremony hadn't begun yet. He watched as Linda entered radiant in a silver gown. Her hair was perfectly styled, her laughter rehearsed. When their eyes met, her smile faltered for a second, then disappeared entirely. She turned away before he could nod. Ethan appeared moments later, walking beside his best man, his face glowing with pride. He looked every bit the man of success, confident, polished, charming. Michael's chest tightened. He wanted to stand to hug him, to say something simple like, "You look good, son." But Ethan didn't see him. He walked past his laughter, filling the hall. Michael remained seated, watching the people gather around his son, offering congratulations, shaking hands. A few glanced at Michael curiously, whispering. One woman leaned toward her friend and asked, "Who's that older man by the window?" Her companion shrugged. "Maybe one of the staff." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the heart. "They don't know," he murmured to himself. And he doesn't care. Before the ceremony began, he approached the wedding planner, a young woman bustling around with a clipboard. "Excuse me," he said kindly. "Could you please make sure this finds my son?" He handed her the velvet pouch with the watch inside. It's from his father. She nodded distractedly. Of course, I'll see that it's delivered. He thanked her and returned to his seat. He didn't notice when she set the pouch down beside a pile of gifts and forgot it. As guests began to fill the rows, Michael sat still, hands folded neatly in his lap. The whispers started again, drifting like smoke through the room. I heard his father was some kind of carpenter. Really hard to believe. Ethan seems so sophisticated. He must take after his mother. He heard every word but didn't flinch. He only looked toward the altar where flowers bloomed white and perfect under the lights. The ceremony began. Chloe, the bride, walked down the aisle, radiant in lace, her eyes full of hope. Ethan's expression softened when he saw her, and for a moment Michael allowed himself to feel something close to peace. He had never met Chloe, but in her gentle demeanor he sensed kindness. She glanced briefly toward the guests, her eyes pausing on Michael for a heartbeat. She smiled, small but real. He nodded back. When the vows were exchanged, Michael listened carefully. He remembered his own wedding to Linda, how they had promised the same things: love, loyalty, partnership, before everything crumbled. He felt no bitterness, only quiet reflection. After the ceremony, the guests moved to the reception hall. The music changed to something lively. Waiters carried trays of champagne. Laughter filled the room like a current. Michael stood at the edge, watching unnoticed. He caught Ethan's voice rising above the noise, joking with friends, exuding charm. When Michael finally approached to offer his congratulations, Ethan turned briefly. "Dad?" he said quickly, his tone polite but distant. "Glad you could make it. Everything's fine, right?" Michael nodded. "Beautiful ceremony." Ethan smiled stiffly. "Try to relax, okay? Don't make things awkward." The words hit softly but cut deep. Michael nodded again, his face calm. "Of course, son. I'm just here to celebrate you." As Ethan moved away, Chloe gave Michael a soft, apologetic look. "He's nervous," she whispered. "He wants everything to be perfect." Michael smiled kindly. "Don't worry. I understand." He found his way back to his seat near the same window as before. The sunset painted the sky orange and gold, the river glimmering in the distance. He rested his hands on his knees, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat slow. Guests began laughing nearby, their voices a low hum. Poor guy. Doesn't fit in here. Probably why they kept him quiet in the back. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing through the sting. When he opened them again, he saw Ethan and Chloe posing for photos, smiles wide and bright. They looked like a perfect couple, untouched by the noise of the world. Michael stood slowly, watching them, his expression unreadable. He didn't leave right away. He walked quietly to the outdoor terrace where the evening air cooled his skin. The river reflected the last colors of the sun, soft waves breaking gently against the shore. He leaned on the railing and whispered, "He's married now. My job is done." But even as he said it, a tremor of unease passed through him. He felt it deep in his chest, the same instinct that had warned him years ago when Linda first began to change. Something told him that the calm of this night was temporary, that storms always follow the stillest skies. He turned to go, casting one last look at the glowing hall behind him. The laughter continued, spilling out through the open doors. For the first time, he realized he was no longer part of that laughter, no longer part of his son's world. As he stepped into the quiet street, the night wrapped around him like an old friend. He walked slowly, hands in his pockets, the soft sound of his shoes on the pavement echoing through the dark. Under his breath, he said, "The day my son became a husband was also the day he forgot how to be a son." And with that, he kept walking, the golden light of the hotel fading behind him, leaving only the sound of the river and the rhythm of his own footsteps. The hall shimmered with golden light. Laughter bounced off crystal walls, champagne glasses clinked in rhythm with the music, and the scent of lilies drifted through the air. It was a perfect celebration for everyone except the father, who sat alone in the corner. Michael adjusted his jacket, his weathered hands resting on the tablecloth as he watched his son move through the crowd like a man born to it. Ethan was radiant. His suit tailored his smile, rehearsed his every gesture, polished by success. People surrounded him, shaking his hand, praising him. "You've really built something incredible," one man said. "Your father must be proud." Ethan laughed lightly. "Yeah," he said, "he's around somewhere." Michael heard it from across the room. The words slid under his skin like small cold blades. He took a sip of water, forcing a smile. The laughter rose again, louder this time, filling the hall like a storm he couldn't stop. He looked at the chandelier above its glow, splintered into hundreds of pieces, and thought how much it reminded him of his life. Bright once, then broken into fragments of light and silence. The master of ceremonies took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for the toast." The music faded. Glasses lifted. Michael straightened in his seat. Linda, graceful as ever, stepped forward. "To our son Ethan," she began, her voice smooth and steady. "You've made us proud. You've become everything we hoped for, and more." She turned slightly, pausing just long enough to make it clear whom she meant by us. "Your mother loves you more than words can say." Applause followed. Michael clapped too, the sound hollow in his ears. Then the host turned to Ethan. And now the groom himself. Ethan took the microphone with a grin that could have sold 1,000 dreams. "Thank you, everyone," he said, raising his glass. "Tonight's not just about marriage, it's about legacy, about building something lasting. My mother taught me ambition, and I'll never forget that." His voice carried easily through the speakers. "As for my father..." He paused, smirking slightly. "Well, he taught me how to use a hammer." The room exploded with laughter. The sound was sharp and ringing. Even the band chuckled. Someone shouted, "Cheers to the hammer," and another voice echoed, "Hard work pays off." Michael smiled faintly, his jaw tightening just enough to hide the tremor beneath. He nodded, pretending to laugh with them. But the heat on his cheeks wasn't from embarrassment. It was from something deeper, a quiet humiliation that burned behind his calm. The music started again. Ethan handed the microphone to the DJ and returned to the dance floor, arm around Chloe. Guests followed, swaying to the rhythm. Michael remained seated. The lights seemed brighter now, almost cruel. A waiter approached, offering him wine. "No, thank you," Michael said softly. "Water's fine." He sat back and watched. Chloe's laughter was genuine, her smile warm. She whispered something to Ethan, and for a moment Michael saw a glimpse of the boy he once knew, the one who used to run barefoot through the backyard, mud on his knees, calling out, "Look what I built, Dad." But the vision faded quickly, replaced by the man on the dance floor, spinning his bride as if he owned the world. Later in the evening, Ethan came over, still riding the high of attention. "Dad, you're not dancing," he said, voice loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. Michael shook his head. "I'll just watch." "Come on," Ethan insisted. "What's the matter? Too old for fun?" The people around them laughed again. Michael's lips curved upward, but his eyes didn't move. "No," he said calmly. "Just not my kind of music." Ethan smirked. "Guess your generation had different rhythms." More laughter. It rolled through the group like a wave. Even Linda smiled, though her eyes darted away when Michael looked at her. The humiliation was soft, almost polite, but it cut just the same. As the night deepened, Ethan grew looser, his voice louder, his jokes sharper. "You know, Dad always said, 'Measure twice, cut once,'" he said to a small group gathered around him. Guess he forgot to measure when it came to keeping Mom happy. The crowd gasped, then laughed nervously. Chloe tugged at his sleeve. "Ethan, stop." He waved her off. "Relax. It's a joke." Michael didn't move. His hands folded together on the table, his knuckles pale. The sound of laughter filled his ears, but all he heard was the hammering of his own heartbeat. A moment later, Ethan turned back toward him. "Hey, Dad, you still fix fences for people." The tone was light mocking. Michael looked up slowly. "Sometimes." Ethan grinned. "Good man. Someone's got to keep the small things standing." The crowd chuckled again. Michael's voice was calm when he replied, "Small things hold the big things together." The laughter faltered for just a second. Then the music returned, and the moment passed. An hour later, the DJ dimmed the lights for the couple's dance. Everyone gathered around, clapping. Michael stood at the edge, hands in his pockets, watching as Ethan and Chloe moved gracefully under the soft glow. The music swelled tender and hopeful. For a fleeting second, Michael felt pride rise in his chest again. Strong, simple, unbroken. But when the song ended, Ethan turned toward him, microphone in hand, and said, "Dad, come on, say something." "A few words for your son." The spotlight shifted. All eyes turned. Michael froze. He could feel the weight of their stares, the pressure of expectation. He stepped forward slowly, took the microphone, and smiled. His voice was quiet but clear. "There's not much to say, really. You're a married man now. You've built a good life. All I can tell you is this respect isn't something you inherit. You earn it. Every day." The silence that followed was brief but sharp. Then came polite applause, cautious, uncertain. Ethan laughed it off. "Always the philosopher, huh, Dad?" He clapped him on the shoulder. "Don't worry, I'll earn it." Later, when the dancing resumed, Michael found himself near the bar, a glass of water in hand. A few younger guests laughed nearby, whispering. One of them said, "Did you see his dad's suit? Looks like something from the '80s. Another chimed in, "Guy probably can't even afford this place." The laughter was soft, but deliberate. Michael turned away, pretending not to hear. He took another sip of water and let the burn of silence wash through him. When it was time to cut the cake, he stayed seated. He watched from afar as Ethan and Chloe fed each other bites, their smiles wide for the cameras. He didn't blame his son. He blamed time. Time had taken the closeness, the laughter, the bond. It had turned his son into a stranger, wearing a familiar face. At some point near midnight, Ethan came over again, flushed and careless from drink. "Dad," he said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're too serious. Smile a little. People think you're sad." Michael looked up. "I'm not sad, son. Just thinking." "Thinking?" Ethan laughed. "That's your problem. You think too much." Michael smiled faintly. "And you don't think enough." The words were quiet, but they hit like a whisper of thunder. Ethan blinked, then chuckled, though it sounded forced. "You always have to have the last word, huh?" Michael stood, adjusting his jacket. "No, just the right one." He started toward the door, pausing only once to glance back. The hall behind him was alive with music, laughter, and light. Ethan stood surrounded by people who admired him, unaware that something far more permanent than pride had just begun to shift. Outside, the night air was cool. Michael took a deep breath, his reflection flickering in the dark window of his truck. He touched his cheek where the laughter had struck harder than any hand. Then he whispered to the empty street, "Respect isn't taught by speeches. It's learned by loss." He started the engine, the sound breaking the stillness of the night. As he drove away, the glow of the wedding hall faded into the distance. Inside that golden room, Ethan danced beneath the light, unaware that his father's silence had already begun to move, the kind of silence that speaks louder than rage and never forgets. The rain began before dawn, a slow, steady rhythm against the windows that filled the silence of Michael's small house. He sat in the kitchen, still wearing the same suit from the night before. The smell of champagne and lilies clung to the fabric like ghosts that refused to leave. His hands rested on the table motionless, while the ticking of the wall clock echoed through the room. He hadn't slept. His reflection in the window looked older than he remembered, eyes hollow, mouth drawn tight, bruised, not on the skin, but deep within the spirit. The sound of laughter from the wedding still haunted him. It rose and fell in his mind like a cruel melody he couldn't silence. He could still hear Ethan's voice, mocking, polished, full of pride. "He taught me how to use a hammer." The words played again, sharper with every repetition. Michael's jaw clenched. He wasn't angry, not yet. Anger was too loud. What he felt was quieter, heavier, a kind of grief that had forgotten how to cry. He stood slowly, pushing the chair back with care, as if noise itself might break something fragile inside him. The light from the street lamps outside filtered through the curtains, cutting thin lines across the room. He moved toward the shelf where his old photographs stood. There was Ethan, age 7, holding a wooden birdhouse, smiling with a missing tooth. There he was at 16, tall and proud, wearing the work gloves Michael had bought him. Michael's hand trembled slightly as he picked up the frame. He ran his thumb over the glass, tracing the outline of his son's younger face. "You used to look at me like I mattered," he whispered. The words slipped into the stillness, unanswered. He placed the frame down and sat again. The kitchen clock ticked on, marking each second like a small reminder of endurance. Outside, the rain thickened, tapping harder on the window panes. He stared at the droplets racing down the glass and thought how easily water erases traces of dust, how quickly time washes away memory. The humiliation from last night replayed in perfect detail: the laughter, the whispers, the flash of cameras, his son's hand resting casually on his shoulder, the sting of words disguised as jokes. Every image was a scar reopening one after another. At some point he realized he was still wearing his wedding shoes. He bent to take them off the leather creasing as he pulled them free. They were polished to perfection, but they looked out of place on him like the night itself, too polished for the truth beneath. He set them aside carefully, as though they belonged to another man. The morning light began to change, softening the gray edges of the room. He reached for his cup, drank the last cold sip of coffee, and exhaled. His hands were steady now. Calmness began to replace the ache. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something different, a decision forming solid and wordless. He looked around the house. The cracked walls he'd patched himself, the wooden floor he'd sanded a dozen times. The clock he'd fixed when it stopped years ago. Every inch of this place had been built by his hands. Every nail, every board carried a piece of him. And suddenly he realized something simple and devastating. He had built everything for everyone else, but never for himself. He leaned back and closed his eyes. The sound of the rain faded into the background of his thoughts. He saw Ethan again, not as the man from last night, but as the boy who used to follow him around, covered in sawdust, asking endless questions. "Why do we build things, Dad?" And he had answered, "Because someone has to make sure the roof stays up when the storm comes." A bitter smile crossed his face. "The storm came," he murmured, "and you left me outside." He rose from the chair and walked toward the small workbench by the window. It was cluttered with old tools, screws, and scraps of wood. The familiar smell of varnish and pine filled his lungs. He placed his palms on the table, feeling the rough grain beneath his skin. The same hands that had built homes, repaired roofs, and held his son through childhood now trembled not from age, but from the weight of all that had been taken for granted. He spoke softly to the empty room. "Respect isn't something you buy with success. It's something you keep alive through kindness." His voice cracked slightly. "And once it's gone, it doesn't come back." The clock struck 7. Michael turned toward it, listening to the chime echo through the small space. It was as if time itself were answering him. He sat again and reached for his old notebook lying on the counter. The pages were filled with notes from years ago. Budgets, reminders, pieces of advice he used to jot down for Ethan. He flipped to a blank page and wrote 3 words in firm, deliberate strokes. "This ends here." He stared at the sentence for a long time. The pen's ink shimmered faintly under the light. It wasn't a vow of vengeance. It was a declaration of self-worth. He was done being the man people looked through. A car passed outside its tires, hissing against the wet road. Michael glanced through the window. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, leaving the world wrapped in silver mist. He went to the sink and washed his face. The cold water stung his skin, clearing the fog in his head. He dried off, stared at his reflection in the mirror above the sink. The man staring back at him wasn't weak. He wasn't defeated. He was simply done. As he walked through the house, he began to collect the remnants of his life. The tools, the photos, the few keepsakes that truly mattered. He didn't know yet what he would do, but he knew he couldn't stay as he was. Something inside him had shifted irrevocably. He found himself standing by the door code and hand keys between his fingers. For a moment he hesitated, listening to the sound of dripping water from the eaves. The air outside smelled clean, washed of yesterday. He stepped out, locking the door behind him. The street was empty except for the faint sound of morning traffic in the distance. He walked to the small park down the road and sat on the bench under the oak tree. The wood was damp beneath him, but he didn't mind. Across the street, a young father was walking with his little boy, holding his hand tightly as they crossed. Michael watched them in silence, something in his chest twisting and then loosening. He imagined what Ethan might have been if life had stayed simple, if success hadn't replaced love. He thought of all the times he had said yes when he should have said enough. He thought of how silence, meant to protect peace, had only made him invisible. The clouds began to thin light, breaking through in streaks of gold. Michael looked up, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly. "Maybe it's not too late," he said under his breath. "Not to fix him, but to fix me." He walked back home slowly, the weight on his shoulders lighter with each step. Inside, he brewed fresh coffee and sat again at the table. This time, the air didn't feel heavy. It felt clean open. He opened his notebook once more and wrote, "When a son forgets his father, a man must remember himself." He underlined the sentence twice. Then he turned to the next page and wrote a single word in the center plan. The simplicity of it made him smile. It wasn't anger that guided him. Now it was clarity. He realized that words could no longer fix what had been broken. Only action could. Outside, the sun finally pierced through the clouds, scattering light across the wet pavement. The house glowed in the warmth, quiet but alive. Michael looked around the room one last time, then closed the notebook gently. He placed it beside the photograph of Ethan as a boy. Their smiles side by side, one frozen in time, the other just beginning to return. He whispered, "I'll make you remember, son." But not with words. And then he rose steady and sure as the morning unfolded into silence. The storm had passed, but what followed was something far more powerful, the calm resolve of a man who had found his strength in the ruins of respect. The morning light crept through the blinds, soft and pale, touching the lines on Michael's face as he sat at the kitchen table with his old notebook open. The coffee beside him had gone cold, but he didn't notice. His pen hovered over the page, the ink dried at the tip, waiting for words to form. Outside, the wind moved through the trees with a low hum, steady and calm like his thoughts. The decision he had made the night before had not vanished with sleep. It had grown sharper, more certain. He no longer felt humiliation or grief. What he felt now was purpose. He turned the page in the notebook and began to write. His handwriting was slow, deliberate. Each word carried the weight of years, but also the precision of a man who had spent his life measuring twice before cutting once. Respect, he wrote, is not owed. It is returned. Beneath it, he drew a small box and wrote one word inside: plan. The sound of the pen scratching against paper steadied him. He began listing the things he remembered about the house, the land, the documents he had kept filed away years ago. His mind moved carefully, tracing every detail, as though each fact might be a key to something greater. There was no anger in his process. It was methodical quiet and patient, the kind of patience only an old craftsman possesses. He stood moved to the drawer near the sink and pulled out an old envelope full of folded papers. They were yellowed at the edges, but neatly kept. Deeds, contracts, tax receipts. He unfolded one after another, reading the small print under the faded letterheads. His name appeared on every page: Michael Ward, co-owner. He sat down slowly, letting the truth settle in. Years ago, he had transferred part of his assets to help Ethan start his company. But the land, his own land, the foundation where the first office had been built, was never fully signed away. At the time, he hadn't thought much about it. He trusted his son completely. Now that forgotten clause was a quiet revelation. The ownership still stood in his name, 51%. He leaned back in his chair, the corner of his mouth curving slightly, not in triumph, but in understanding. Life, it seemed, had given him one final tool. He whispered to the empty room, "You built your empire on my ground, son." The words were soft, but carried a quiet power. He folded the papers carefully and placed them on the table, then reached for his phone. The number he dialed belonged to Robert Green, a man he hadn't spoken to in years. Robert had been his lawyer once, back when he and Linda bought their first house. After 2 rings, a familiar voice answered. "Michael, good Lord. It's been ages." Michael smiled faintly. "It has." "How are you, Robert? I'm retired, old friend. These days I just read the paper and complain about politics. Then I won't take much of your peace," Michael said. "I need a favor." Quietly. Robert's tone shifted. "Of course." "What kind of favor?" Michael explained, his words calm and measured. He spoke of the property, the paperwork, the names still attached. He spoke of what happened at the wedding, though only the facts, not the pain. When he finished, there was silence on the line. Finally, Robert said, "You still have legal rights to that land, Michael. Full authority. If you want to sell it, no one can stop you. Not even your son." Michael closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in deeply. "Then I want it done. Quietly. Cleanly." "I'll handle it," Robert said. "I know a buyer who values discretion. You'll have your peace, I promise." "Thank you, old friend." "Michael," Robert added gently, "you're not doing this for revenge, are you?" Michael's gaze drifted to the photograph of Ethan as a boy framed beside the window. "No," he said softly. "I'm doing this for respect." When he hung up, the house felt different, lighter somehow, though unchanged. The papers still sat on the table, but they no longer looked like pieces of the past. They were pieces of the truth. He gathered them neatly, placed them in a folder, and slid it into his briefcase. The rest of the day passed in deliberate silence. He cleaned the house, polished the wooden table, trimmed the small garden outside. It was as if he were preparing his world for a shift he could already feel coming. As the afternoon light turned golden, he took a walk down to the small park nearby. The children were playing on the swings, their laughter echoing faintly in the breeze. He watched them for a while, smiling quietly. At the far end of the park, a young father knelt beside his son, helping him tie his shoelaces. Michael's chest tightened at the sight. It was so simple, that gesture: patience, love, care. He wondered if Ethan remembered any of those small lessons. Probably not. But that was fine. He would remember for both of them. That evening, when he returned home, the house smelled faintly of rain and old pine wood. He poured himself a glass of water and sat at the table again. The clock ticked steadily behind him. He opened his notebook and wrote another sentence: "Justice does not shout. It acts." He underlined the words slowly, then leaned back and closed his eyes. The next morning, Robert called. "It's all possible," he said. "I've found a buyer. Private investor, no public records until finalization. The process will take a few weeks." Michael listened quietly. "Do it." "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." When he ended the call, he walked to the window and looked out at the small world he had built with his hands. Every nail, every wall, every board seemed to whisper back to him. It wasn't pride he felt. It was relief. For years he had thought dignity was something people owed him for his sacrifices. Now he understood it was something he owed himself. In the evenings that followed, he began to write again. Not about anger or family, but about lessons, his own private reflections on what it meant to be a man, a father, a builder. One page read, "The things we give freely are the things that teach us who we are when they're taken away." Each night he wrote by lamplight until the words began to feel lighter, freer. The pain that once kept him awake now gave him reason to stay awake. One night he pulled out the small watch box again. Inside lay the watch meant for Ethan. He wound it slowly, listening to the soft ticking. The rhythm was steady, alive. "Time doesn't stop for anyone," he said quietly. "But sometimes it circles back." He placed the watch beside his notebook, a symbol of the time he had given and the time he was reclaiming. Days passed in calm precision. Robert called again to confirm that the sale was progressing smoothly. "Everything's legal, everything's quiet," he said. "He won't find out until it's over." Michael thanked him. After the call, he brewed a fresh pot of coffee and stood on the porch, watching the street below. Children rode bicycles, a dog barked in the distance. Life moved on without noticing the man who had chosen to move differently, silently, steadily, with purpose. He thought of Ethan, of the empire he had built on borrowed ground. The irony no longer stung. It simply existed like truth often does, unbothered, inevitable. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, Michael wrote one final line in his notebook before closing it. If respect dies in silence, it must be reborn the same way. He blew out the lamp, leaving the room in darkness, except for the faint glow of moonlight spilling through the window. The papers were in order. The process had begun. There was nothing left to say. When he finally went to bed, his mind was clear. No bitterness, no regret, only quiet certainty. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying away the last traces of humiliation. Inside, Michael slept soundly for the first time in years, the faint tick of the watch beside his bed, marking the beginning of something new. The morning came with a soft fog that rolled over the quiet streets like smoke. Michael sat by the window, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand. The same calm expression fixed on his face since the day he made his decision. The papers lay on the table beside him, stacked neatly in a brown envelope marked "Private Transaction." He had read them a dozen times. Every line was clean, every clause airtight. The house was still the kind of silence that doesn't ache anymore. It simply exists like breath or truth. He stood, stretched his back, and buttoned his coat. The air outside was cool, the sky a shade between gray and silver. He drove into town slowly, the hum of the truck blending with the rhythm of his thoughts. There was no rush. Everything was already in motion. Robert had arranged the final signatures for that day, and all that was left for Michael was to show up and make it official. When he reached the lawyer's office, Robert was already waiting at the door with his usual calm smile. "Morning, Michael," he said, holding out his hand. "You ready?" Michael shook it firmly. "As ready as I'll ever be." They walked through the glass doors into the quiet building. The walls smelled faintly of paper and old coffee, the scent of decisions being made. Inside the meeting room, a folder sat open on the table next to a fountain pen. Robert gestured for him to sit. "This is the last step. Once you sign, the property will be transferred. The payment will go directly to your account." Michael nodded, glancing over the papers one more time. The words blurred slightly, not from doubt, but from the weight of finality. "And he won't know until it's done." "Not until the official notice is delivered," Robert said. 2, maybe 3 days at most." Michael smiled faintly. "Good. I don't want noise." He took the pen in his hand. His signature was slow, deliberate, precise, each curve and stroke pressed firmly into the page. As the final line dried, Robert exhaled softly. "It's done." Michael set the pen down, then let the world move on. They shared a quiet moment. There were no handshakes this time, no celebration. Just 2 old men who understood that justice, when done right, doesn't need applause. As he left the office, the city seemed brighter, though the sky had darkened. People hurried by with their umbrellas, talking into phones, living lives untouched by his decision. He felt oddly invisible, and for the first time that felt like freedom. He stopped by a small diner on the edge of town, ordered black coffee and eggs. The waitress smiled, calling him sir in a way that carried warmth rather than habit. He thanked her, left a generous tip, and sat for a long while after finishing his meal. Through the window, the clouds began to clear, and sunlight slipped through, striking the wet pavement in narrow streaks. He thought about Ethan. His son would be at the company headquarters by now, smiling for cameras, shaking hands with investors, believing he stood on solid ground. Michael imagined the confidence in his voice, the charm that filled rooms so easily. But under that voice, under those words, the foundation was shifting. Not out of malice, not for revenge, but for balance. He whispered to himself, "A man can't learn respect through comfort. He learns it when the ground moves beneath him." By afternoon, Michael was back home. The rain had stopped completely, leaving the air sharp and clean. He walked through each room, pausing here and there by the bookshelf, the framed photographs, the small crack in the wall he'd always meant to fix. This house had witnessed everything: love, silence, humiliation, and now quiet justice. He ran his hand along the wooden banister, feeling the texture of time itself. He went to his desk, opened his notebook, and wrote, "A craftsman builds for others. But every man deserves to rebuild for himself." He underlined the words twice, then closed the book. The clock ticked steadily in the background. 2 days passed in peace. He did his usual chores, worked in the garden, read in the evenings. Then, early on the 3rd morning, his phone buzzed. It was Robert. "It's official," the lawyer said. "The sale has gone through. Everything's finalized. The new owners are anonymous for now, just like you wanted." Michael nodded. "Thank you." Robert hesitated. "He'll know soon." "I know," Michael replied softly. "Let him." That afternoon, Michael drove out to the property one last time. The land stretched wide under a pale sky. The building standing proud in the distance, a monument to his years of labor and his son's ambition. He parked near the old fence line, stepping out onto the gravel. The ground was still damp from rain. He knelt, scooped a handful of soil into his palm, and let it trickle slowly through his fingers. "You were mine long before he was," he said quietly. "And you'll still be mine in the way that matters." For a long moment he stood there, watching the sunlight glint off the metal roof of the main building. He could almost hear the echoes of construction, the sound of saws, hammers, laughter from younger days. The smell of wood and sweat. His own voice shouting, "Measure twice, cut once." All of it lingered like a distant song. When he got back into the truck, the engine turned over smoothly. He looked at the steering wheel, at the calluses on his hands, and realized they had built more than houses. They had built stories. Some of them painful, some unspoken, but all of them true. That night he made himself a simple dinner and sat by the open window listening to the sound of wind through the trees. The stars were faint but steady, the kind of night that doesn't ask for anything but quiet. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and raised it slightly toward the darkness outside. To silence, he said softly, and to the lessons it teaches. He took a slow sip. The warmth spread through him deep and steady. The next morning brought a call he didn't answer. Then another. And another. He knew it was coming, the first ripples of realization. He let the phone ring until it stopped the beeping sound, cutting into silence. He set it face down on the table and continued eating his breakfast. The news would travel fast enough. Later, as he walked down to the post office, the townspeople nodded politely, unaware of what he had done. To them, he was just an old man with kind eyes and a quiet gait. That anonymity felt like armor. By evening, Robert called again. "He's found out," he said simply. "I know," Michael replied. "What did he say?" "Nothing yet." "But he will." Michael smiled faintly. "Then let him find his words. Mine are finished." He ended the call and walked outside. The sun was setting, painting the horizon in colors of fire and dust. The air smelled faintly of rain again, as if the world were cleansing itself of noise. He sat on the porch, hands clasped together, and breathed deeply. Somewhere in the distance, a storm was forming. He could feel it in the shift of the wind. But this time, he wasn't afraid of storms. He had lived through worse. He whispered to the fading light, "You taught me how to fall silent, son. Now you'll learn what silence can do." The night fell around him soft and deep. The clock inside struck 9. He didn't move. He didn't need to. Everything he had set in motion was already alive, steady, and certain, moving through the world like quiet truth. He sat there until the stars came out, until the air grew cold, until the silence felt like peace. Then he stood, walked back inside, and turned off the light. The next chapter of his life had already begun, and for the first time in years, it belonged only to him. The sun poured through the glass windows of Ethan's penthouse, illuminating a world built on illusion. The city stretched beneath him, bright and restless. He stood before the mirror, straightening his tie, the reflection of success smiling back at him. Today was a good day. A new deal, a new investor, another victory. His phone buzzed constantly. Messages from colleagues, congratulations from friends, calls from his wife, reminding him not to forget the interview later that afternoon. He glanced at his watch and grinned. Everything was in its place. Every piece of his life was shining. Except somewhere in that glitter, he had forgotten the foundation that held it all. He didn't know that by nightfall, the empire he had built on pride would start to crack. At breakfast, Chloe sat across from him, flipping through her phone. "The press is calling your company the next big national brand," she said, smiling. "They even mentioned your father in one of the early drafts. I asked them to take it out. I figured you'd want to keep things clean, right?" Ethan nodded absent-mindedly. "Yeah, it's better that way. No need to confuse the story." The words passed easily from his lips. But when she looked at him, there was a flicker of something, doubt, maybe disappointment. Before she could say more, his assistant called, reminding him of the investor meeting. He kissed Chloe's cheek, grabbed his coat, and left. By mid-morning, he was sitting in the boardroom of Ward Enterprises, surrounded by sleek suits and expensive watches. His team was confident, the air thick with ambition. "Once this deal goes through," his vice president said, "we'll have full control of the expansion site. We're already clearing the next phase of construction." Ethan nodded. "Good. Make sure the paperwork is airtight. I don't want any surprises." They laughed. The irony would arrive soon enough. Around noon, the courier entered the meeting room, a man in a gray uniform carrying a manila envelope. "For Mr. Ethan Ward," he said. The assistant took it and handed it to Ethan with a grin. "Probably another congratulations letter," she joked. Ethan tore it open carelessly. Inside were 3 sheets of paper clipped together. The words were simple, direct, and devastating. Notice of property transfer. Effective immediately, the land at 4177 Broad Street, Charleston is no longer registered under Ward Enterprises. For a moment, Ethan didn't understand what he was reading. Then his stomach turned cold. His hand tightened around the paper, the color draining from his face. "What is this?" he demanded, looking at his assistant. The room fell silent. He flipped to the final page. There it was, the legal seal, the signature of transfer. He read the name again. The buyer was a holding company he didn't recognize. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Who sold this?" The vice president frowned. "That's impossible. You own that land, Ethan." Ethan shook his head slowly. "No, I don't. Not anymore." He called his lawyer immediately, his hand trembling slightly as he waited for the line to connect. When the familiar voice answered, Ethan didn't waste time. "Daniel, tell me this isn't real. Someone's trying to screw with me." There was a pause. The lawyer sighed. "Ethan, I looked into it this morning. It's real. Your father still held controlling ownership of that property. Legally, he had every right to sell." Ethan froze. The world around him seemed to go still. He could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning, the whisper of someone shifting in their seat, the dull ringing in his own ears. "My father," he repeated the word, hollow. "Yes," the lawyer said. "The sale's been finalized. There's no loophole." Ethan's chest tightened. "When? 3 days ago?" He ended the call without another word. The paper in his hand shook as he stared at it. His father's signature wasn't there. Michael had used a representative. But the act spoke louder than any words could. He had done it. Quietly. Completely. Someone whispered from across the table, "Is something wrong, mister?" Ward Ethan looked up. The faces watching him were full of curiosity, confusion, maybe even pity. His lips parted, but no sound came. Finally, he stood his chair scraping back across the floor. "The meeting's over," he said, his voice low. "Get out." They hesitated only a moment before gathering their things and leaving. The room emptied quickly, leaving him alone with the papers and the echo of his humiliation. He walked to the window and stared out at the city. His reflection in the glass looked foreign pale, broken smaller. The skyline stretched endlessly before him, the symbol of everything he had conquered. Now it all seemed built on air. By evening, the news had begun to spread. The whispers turned into headlines. Ward Enterprises loses key property in sudden legal transfer. Sources confirm land sold by father of CEO. The humiliation that once belonged to his father now clung to him. At home, Chloe met him at the door, her expression tight. "Ethan," she said softly. "I heard. Is it true?" He nodded, his voice barely audible. "He sold it." She took a step closer. "Why?" He laughed bitterly. "Why? Because he could. Because he wanted to remind me where I came from." "He's been waiting for this." Chloe's eyes filled with tears. "No. That's not who he is. You don't know him." Ethan snapped. "You don't know what he's capable of." She stared at him, stunned. "No, Ethan. I think I know exactly who he is. Maybe you're the one who doesn't." He turned away, running a hand through his hair. "I'll fix it. I'll get it back." But as he said it, he knew it was a lie. The phone rang again, and he answered it with shaking hands. It was one of his investors. "We need reassurance, Ethan. the man said flatly. This kind of instability isn't good for our confidence. Ethan tried to speak, but the words stumbled out. It's being handled. Another call came, then another. Journalists, shareholders, reporters, all demanding answers. The empire he had spent years constructing was unraveling overnight. He poured himself a drink and sat on the couch, staring at nothing. The sound of Chloe crying softly in the kitchen reached him, but he couldn't move. His father's face filled his mind, not the man from last night, but the one from years ago, the one who had taught him to hold a hammer, the one whose hands had built everything Ethan stood on. By the next morning, the story was everywhere. Photographs of him at the wedding, beside headlines like "The Silent Revenge of a Father." People called it poetic justice. They called it karma. Ethan stopped answering the phone. He couldn't bear to hear the pity in their voices. That afternoon, he drove to his father's house. The sky was overcast, the air heavy with the promise of rain. When Michael opened the door, he looked exactly the same. Calm, composed, unshaken. Ethan stood there, soaked from the drizzle, eyes wide with disbelief. "Why did you do it?" he demanded. Michael didn't flinch. "Because you forgot what I built for you. You humiliated me." Ethan's voice cracked. In front of everyone, Michael's tone remained level. "You did that to yourself long before I ever acted." The silence between them stretched, filled only by the sound of rain hitting the roof. Ethan's breath came ragged. "I was your son," he said finally, his voice trembling. "You still are," Michael replied. "That's why I didn't destroy you. I just reminded you that respect has a cost." Ethan's shoulders sagged. The rage in him was collapsing into something else, shame, grief, recognition. He looked at his father, really looked at him, and saw not a man seeking revenge, but a man who had finally stood up for himself. Michael stepped aside and nodded toward the empty chair inside. "Come in if you want to talk." But Ethan couldn't move. His throat tightened, his voice gone. He turned slowly, walking back toward his car, each step heavier than the last. When he drove away, Michael watched from the doorway. The rain came harder, washing the dust from the porch. He whispered to the storm. He understands now. That night, in the quiet of his home, Michael sat by the window with a cup of tea. The newspaper lay folded on the table, the headline visible, "A Father's Quiet Justice." He read it once, then set it aside. He wasn't proud. He wasn't triumphant. He was simply free. Outside, the rain slowed to a gentle drizzle, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled like a final word spoken softly. The morning after the storm, the city was quiet. A gray sky hung low over Charleston, and the streets still shimmered with rain. Michael sat on his porch with a cup of black coffee, watching the world wake slowly. A newspaper lay folded beside him. The headline read, "CEO Ethan Ward faces backlash after property loss scandal." He didn't need to read the rest. The story was already over for him. Inside his small house, everything looked the same, simple, neat, and calm. The dishes were washed. The photographs still lined the shelf. The world had not changed, but Michael had. There was a stillness in him now, the kind that comes after a long storm has spent its rage. He had no anger left, no pride to defend, no words to say. Only quiet certainty. Miles away in the heart of the city, Ethan sat in his office staring at the remnants of his empire. The blinds were closed, the air heavy with silence. His phone buzzed endlessly, but he didn't move to answer it. One by one, his investors had pulled out. Contracts dissolved overnight. His name had become gossip, his company a symbol of arrogance, undone. On his desk lay a single envelope, the same one his father had signed days earlier. It seemed to glow with its own kind of quiet power. Chloe entered softly, her footsteps barely audible on the carpet. "Ethan," she said gently, "you should eat something." He shook his head. "It's funny," he said, his voice rough. "I thought I could buy respect. I thought I could build it. But it turns out it was never mine to buy." Chloe knelt beside him, resting a hand on his arm. "He didn't take anything from you that wasn't already his. You built everything on his ground. You just forgot to thank him for it." Ethan let out a long breath. "I wanted to be more than him." "Maybe being more," she said softly, "isn't about building higher. Maybe it's about knowing who helped you stand." He looked at her for a long moment, then turned his gaze toward the window. Outside, the clouds were breaking, thin light cutting through. "Do you think he'll ever forgive me?" Chloe smiled sadly. "He already did. He just didn't say it." Across town, Michael folded the newspaper and placed it aside. He stood stretching his back and walked into the kitchen. The kettle whistled softly as he poured hot water into a mug. He moved slower now, not from age, but from peace. Each motion deliberate, unhurried. He had done what needed to be done. The phone rang. He didn't answer. It rang again and again. On the fourth ring, he picked it up. Michael came Robert's voice, warm and familiar. "It's all over the news. Your son's been humbled, to say the least." Michael smiled faintly. "The world teaches what I couldn't." Robert hesitated. "You don't sound proud." "I'm not," Michael said. "Pride's what broke him in the first place." There was a pause. "So what now?" Michael looked around his small kitchen. Now he said softly, "I rest." That afternoon, Linda appeared at his door for the first time in years. She stood uncertainly, her hair perfect, but her eyes tired. "You did it," she said quietly. "You won." Michael leaned against the doorway. There was nothing to win, Linda. There was only what was right. She looked down, twisting her hands. "I told him once you were too simple to understand ambition. I see now you understood everything better than either of us." He smiled faintly. "Ambition isn't wrong. But forgetting where it comes from, that's the real sin." Her eyes filled with tears. "You think he'll ever recover? From pride, maybe? From shame, I hope so. But from what he's done to himself, that's on him now." She nodded slowly. "He's broken, Michael. Completely." He sighed, the kind of sigh that carries both love and weariness. Then maybe he's ready to rebuild. For a long time she said nothing. Then she stepped forward and placed something on the small table by the door. It was a photograph Ethan at 5 years old, holding a toy hammer, grinning up at his father. "I thought you should have this," she said. Michael glanced at it, but didn't pick it up. "He'll need it more than I do." When she left, the silence that followed felt softer than before. He looked out at the garden, the leaves trembling in a gentle breeze. For the first time, the quiet didn't feel empty, it felt earned. Meanwhile, in the city, Ethan sat in his office long after sunset. The lights of Charleston twinkled outside his window, distant and indifferent. The laughter of his wedding guests, once a memory of triumph, now haunted him like an echo from another life. He poured himself a drink, stared at his reflection in the dark glass, and whispered, "He warned me. I just never listened." Chloe appeared in the doorway. "Come home," she said softly. He looked up, exhausted. "To what?" "To something real," she said. "It's not too late to start over." He nodded weakly, setting the glass down. The clink of crystal against wood sounded final. "I'll go tomorrow," he said. When morning came, Ethan drove out of the city, past the suburbs, past the fields, until the skyline disappeared in his rear-view mirror. The air smelled of salt and pine. He parked a few blocks away from his father's house and sat there, hands on the steering wheel, staring at the familiar porch. The same one he had stormed away from years ago. The same one that had waited for him all this time. but he couldn't step out. He couldn't knock. Instead, he took out his phone, typed a message, and deleted it. Then he reached into the glove compartment and pulled out an old photograph, him and his father standing in front of the first office, smiling. He stared at it for a long time, before setting it carefully on the passenger seat. Inside the house, Michael sat by the window, feeling a strange pull in his chest. He didn't know his son was outside. He didn't need to. Some silences speak for themselves. That evening, as the sun sank behind the trees, he wrote another note in his notebook. A man can lose everything and still win back his name if he learns to bow without breaking. He closed the book and went for a walk down the quiet street. The neighbors waved. He waved back. The world was small, ordinary, and peaceful. Everything he had ever wanted it to be. By nightfall, the city had moved on to new headlines. The scandal was already fading, replaced by fresher stories. But in two homes, the father's and the son's silence lingered, like a thread tying them still. In his apartment, Ethan sat on the floor beside the packed boxes of what was left of his life. He opened one of them and found the wooden watch box his father had once given him. He opened it. Inside, the watch ticked steady and alive. He smiled through the tears that came uninvited. "I hear you, Dad," he whispered. "I finally hear you." At that same hour, Michael stood outside under a blanket of stars. He looked up at the sky and murmured, "Every man has his own time, son. Yours has just begun." The breeze stirred softly around him, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed a low, mournful sound that faded into the night. He smiled faintly, turned back toward the house, and closed the door behind him. In the quiet that followed, there was no anger, no bitterness, no victory, only peace. The kind that comes not from justice, but from letting go. The ocean stretched wide and silver before him, waves rolling in soft and steady rhythm against the shore. Michael stood barefoot at the edge of the sand, his shoes in one hand, the wind tugging lightly at his jacket. The coastal air smelled of salt and peace, a scent that had become the rhythm of his mornings in this small seaside town. Months had passed since the day he'd walked away from everything. His house, his past, his son. Time had moved gently here without noise or memory, washing the sharp edges of pain into something quieter, something almost sacred. He spent his days in simple patterns, mornings by the sea, afternoons at the small carpenter's shed he had rented from a local fisherman, evenings writing by the dim light of an old lamp. The people here didn't know who he was, and that anonymity had become his salvation. To them, he was simply Mr. Ward, the man who makes wooden toys for the children. They didn't ask about the sadness in his eyes, and he didn't offer stories. The past no longer demanded an audience. He bent to pick up a small piece of driftwood and turned it in his hands. Its shape reminded him of a heart broken but smoothed by time and water. He smiled faintly, tucked it into his pocket, and began walking back toward the small cottage that sat near the dunes. The sea behind him whispered softly, as if promising that some wounds need only the quiet to heal. Inside the cottage, the light filtered through white curtains, illuminating the desk near the window. On it sat his notebook, now filled with neat, careful writing. He opened it and began to write again. "When I left the city, I thought I was escaping pain. But it wasn't escape, it was understanding. Sometimes leaving isn't running away. It's choosing where peace can finally find you." He paused, letting the words breathe. His handwriting trembled slightly, but not from weakness, from life. From the steady pulse of someone who had finally learned to live without needing to prove his worth. A soft knock came at the door. He turned surprised. Visitors were rare here. He opened it to find a young man, maybe in his 30s, holding a letter in one hand and a nervous expression on his face. "Mr. Ward?" the man asked. "Yes," Michael said slowly. The man handed him the envelope. "It's from Charleston. I was asked to deliver it personally. Michael took the envelope, his fingers brushing the heavy paper. "Thank you," he said quietly. The man nodded and left his footsteps, fading into the sound of the wind. For a long moment, Michael stood there staring at the envelope. He already knew who it was from. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, his son's. He sat down, the weight of the letter resting heavy in his hands. Then slowly, he tore the seal. Inside was a single sheet folded carefully. The handwriting was uneven, as if written through hesitation. "Father," it began. "I don't know where to begin. I've started this letter 100 times and torn it up 100 more. I don't know if you'll ever read it or if you even care to. But I need to say this anyway." Michael's eyes moved over the words, slow and deliberate. "When I stood at that wedding, I thought strength meant pride. I thought being powerful meant being untouchable. I thought respect was something I could demand. But that day when you didn't fight back, when you didn't shout, when you simply walked away, I felt something I couldn't name. I called it humiliation then. Now I know it was shame. Not yours, mine." He paused, his throat tightening. "The world watched me laugh at the man who built my world. And when you answered me with silence, I finally heard everything you'd ever tried to teach me. I lost my company, my house, my reputation, but none of it mattered because I realized I had lost you long before that day." Michael set the letter down, pressing a hand against his chest as if to steady his breathing. "I've been rebuilding, Father. Not money, not business, just myself. I don't know if I'll ever be the man you hoped I'd be, but I'm trying. Every day. I understand now what dignity looks like. It looks like you. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know that I finally see you." The letter ended with a single line written in smaller script. "If peace lives anywhere, I hope it's found you. Your son, Ethan." Michael sat for a long while, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the window, carrying the faint sound of the tide. He closed his eyes. For the first time in years, tears came easily quiet, unforced pure. They rolled down his cheeks, not in sorrow, but in release. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his notebook. Then he stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the endless water. "You finally learned," he whispered, his voice breaking into the wind. "And that's enough." The next day, he walked into town. The locals greeted him as they always did, with friendly nods, a wah here and there. He stopped by the small pier, watching the fishermen haul in their nets. One of them, an older man with a red cap, called out, "Morning, Mr. Ward. The kids loved those boats you made." "You've got a gift." Michael smiled. "It's not much," he said. The fisherman laughed. "Ah, but the simple things are the ones that last." He nodded slowly. "You're right. They always are." Later that afternoon, he returned home, took the driftwood heart from his pocket, and carved it gently with his small knife. When he was finished, he placed it beside the letter on the desk. On it, he etched one word: forgiven. The days that followed carried a quiet lightness. Michael found himself waking earlier, walking longer, smiling more. He had not written back to Ethan yet. He didn't need to, not yet. The letter was enough for now. Understanding had its own language, and silence could speak more kindly than words. One evening, as the sun dipped low, he sat on the porch, the horizon burning gold. A car engine hummed softly in the distance, then stopped. He turned and saw a figure standing at the edge of the path. For a moment, he thought it was memory playing tricks. But the man was real. Ethan stood there, hesitant, holding his hands in front of him like a boy, unsure of where to begin. Michael didn't move. Neither spoke. The ocean filled the silence between them. Then slowly, Michael gestured to the empty chair beside him. Ethan walked forward step by step and sat down. They watched the waves for a long time, without a word. The sea was calm, the light turning soft and silver. Finally, Ethan said quietly, "I didn't come to ask for anything." "I know," Michael replied. "I just wanted to see you." Michael looked at him, really looked, and saw not the proud man from the wedding, not the son who had hurt him, but the child he had once held against his chest on stormy nights. He nodded once, then stay for a while. They sat there until the stars began to appear, two silhouettes against the vast sea, the distance between them slowly closing without a single apology spoken. Sometimes words weren't needed. Sometimes peace came simply by showing up. When Ethan finally rose to leave, he turned to his father. "Will I see you again?" Michael smiled faintly. "That depends," he said. "Are you coming back as a son or as a stranger?" Ethan's eyes glistened. "As your son." "Then I'll be here." As the younger man walked away, the tide rolled in quietly, touching the edges of the shore like a benediction. Michael watched until the car disappeared down the road. Then he whispered to the night, "You found your way home." The wind carried the words out to sea, where they dissolved into the rhythm of the waves, and the stars above shimmered like witnesses to a long-awaited forgiveness. The sea was calm that morning, a mirror of soft gold under the rising sun. Michael sat on the porch with a cup of warm tea, the steam curling gently into the air. The air smelled of salt and pine, and the sound of gulls drifted lazily from the distant pier. He had grown used to this rhythm, the quiet hum of life untouched by noise. Every sunrise here felt like a new beginning, and for the first time in years, he woke without the weight of regret. He opened his notebook, the same one that had followed him through every turn of his story. Its pages were full now, less of plans and anger, more of reflections, lessons, and small thoughts written in calm ink. On the first page, where his handwriting had once been sharp and heavy, the words still read, "This ends here." But now, as he turned to the last page, he smiled faintly. Maybe endings were just quieter beginnings. The carved piece of driftwood sat beside the notebook. The word "forgiven" glowed faintly under the sunlight, carved deep but smooth, its edges worn by time. He touched it lightly, his thumb tracing each letter. Forgiveness had once felt impossible, like asking the ocean to return every wave it had carried away. But now it felt as natural as breathing. He rose from his chair and walked down toward the beach, his footsteps sinking softly into the cool sand. The tide was low, leaving streaks of seashells scattered like small memories. Every sound, the rhythm of the sea, the whisper of the wind, seemed to speak in a language he finally understood. Peace wasn't silence. It was presence. As he stood there, the past returned not as pain, but as understanding. He thought of the house he had built, the slap that had shattered years of devotion, the decision that had restored his dignity. He thought of the quiet act that changed everything, not as revenge, but as truth. Time had reshaped every wound into something gentler. What once bled now simply breathed. When he walked back to the cottage, a small envelope waited on the step. The handwriting was familiar, Ethan's. Michael sat on the porch, the envelope trembling slightly in his hand, and tore it open carefully. "Father," it began, "I'm still learning how to build again, not just walls, but a life. I've opened a small workshop downtown. I carve now, not for money, but for peace. Every time I shape the wood, I remember how you used to say that silence makes a craftsman better. You were right. Silence is where things grow straight." Michael's throat tightened. He continued reading slowly. "I know we can't erase what happened, and I don't expect you to forget. But I wanted you to know that I've learned. Respect isn't something you demand, It's something you earn by the way you live. Thank you for teaching me that. I'll come visit soon. Not to talk about the past, but to show you what I've built from it." The letter ended with a single line in smaller handwriting. "Your son, Ethan." Michael folded the letter gently and placed it inside the notebook. Then he sat back, letting the soft wind move through his hair. His eyes stung not from sorrow, but from pride, the kind that comes when a lesson finally takes root in the heart it was meant for. Later that day, he walked to his small seaside workshop. The scent of sawdust and varnish filled the air. On his work table lay a half-finished wooden boat, tiny, delicate, meant for one of the village children. He picked up a brush and smoothed the paint across its hull, steady and sure. Outside the window, sunlight flashed off the water like scattered gold. A young boy entered barefoot and curious, his eyes bright. "Mr. Ward," he asked, "why do you always work so quietly?" Michael smiled without looking up. "Because when you work in silence," he said softly, "you can hear what the wood wants to become." The boy tilted his head, thinking, "And what does it say?" Michael chuckled, setting the brush down. "That even broken pieces can still become something beautiful." The boy grinned, thanked him, and ran off toward the beach, clutching his repaired boat. Michael watched him go, his heart light. He turned back to his workbench and picked up his pen. On the next empty page of his notebook, he wrote, "The legacy of a father is not what he leaves behind, but what he leaves within." Evening came slowly, painting the sky in deep shades of amber and blue. Michael returned to his porch, the ocean glowing with the last breath of daylight. He poured himself another cup of tea and let the sound of the waves carry him into thought. He thought of Ethan as a boy barefoot in the yard, holding a hammer too big for his hands. He thought of Ethan as a man proud, lost, broken, and finally learning to rebuild. The images blended together like waves, folding over one another until they became one sea. He whispered to the wind, "I forgive you, son. Truly." A calm filled the air, quiet but complete. Somewhere beyond the horizon, he imagined Ethan carving in his new shop, learning the patience his father had always carried. The circle had closed not in words, but in understanding. He took a deep breath, closing the notebook one last time. The edges were frayed, but its story was whole. He placed it on the table beside the driftwood heart and leaned back in his chair. The stars began to appear, faint and steady, scattered across the wide sky. The sea shimmered under their reflection, endless and alive. For the first time, Michael didn't feel alone. He felt connected to the world, to the son he had forgiven, to the silence that had saved him. He smiled softly and said to no one in particular, "Maybe peace isn't something you find. Maybe it's something you build quietly." The night deepened. The waves rolled closer to shore. The story that had begun with pain now ended with stillness. And as the scene faded, a gentle voice lingered Michael's reflection, reaching beyond the page. If you've ever known what it feels like to be broken, or if you've ever chosen silence when anger called louder, tell me your story below. I want to know how you found your peace. And if this story reminded you of something real, of family forgiveness or quiet strength, stay with us. There are more stories like this waiting to be told. Stories of dignity, of love, of the kind of revenge that ends with redemption. Because sometimes, he said as the wind carried his words into the dark, the loudest victories are won in silence. The sea kept moving, calm and endless, and Michael Ward sat quietly under the stars. A man who had finally reclaimed not just his dignity, but his peace.